My heart hit my ribs like a hammer the second those words landed. Did you know your mom was my favorite student? I grabbed Jason by the arm and dragged him away from the table like I could physically wrench the sentence out of my head if I moved fast enough. He was still chewing when I told him what Dad had said, and for a second his laugh came out wrong, clipped, then stopped. He swallowed and said, "What the hell are you talking about?" His voice cracked on the last word, and I hated how familiar the sound was. Like we'd both swallowed the same poison inside the same house for years. Grandma came out onto the porch in her cardigan and slippers, a cigarette burning slow between two fingers. She only smoked when something pulled a thread in her chest, and tonight she didn't bother with hiding the pack. I had watched her tuck things away for decades, so seeing her arm bare felt like watching a lock break open. She took a long drag and blew smoke toward the backyard like it was a signal. "Your father's a sick man," she said, plain as a weather report, with a voice that sounded like it had been locked in a basement for 30 years. I remember the way the smoke curled into the night and the way the words sat between us and kept growing. She told us the story in pieces at first, like she was handing over coins one by one. She said Mom was 16 when she met Dad, and he was 39, the kind of math that should have slammed alarms into everyone's heads. He was her English teacher. He praised her writing, called her mature, told her she had a mind bigger than the town could hold. He pulled her into after-class talks and made compliments that sounded like compliments until they weren't. He painted a future for her, a future with scholarships and honors. And then, quietly, he started trimming the edges off that future until there was nothing left to sew back together. "Why didn't anyone stop him?" I asked, because the question burned hotter than anything else. Grandma sat down hard on the porch ledge and laughed, only it wasn't funny, it was the rattling kind that comes from a place too tired to cry. She said people looked away or told themselves the same soothing lies we learn in church pews and PTA meetings. She said some parents thought praise from a teacher was a gift. Some people said kids could handle attention. Others, she said, were afraid of the scandal. They moved some of them away, took them out of town so the whispers would stop, she said, and I heard the years in that sentence like a bad echo. I felt this cold knowledge spread through me, like ice under the skin, connecting dots I hadn't known were there. The prom photographs we had at home flashed in my head, my mother in that pale dress, smiling the way people smile to keep other people calm, not because they are calm. I thought about the college acceptance letter we had framed once upon a time and then hidden away after she died, as if paper could be a wound. I thought about how many times Dad volunteered to drive us places, how he lingered in hallways at school events, how he praised young women at Sunday choir rehearsals in ways that made me guess wrong for too long. Grandma reached into her cardigan and pulled out an old envelope with Mom's maiden name in handwriting that shook. She didn't hand it to me right away, she set it on the railing between us like it was smoldering coal. "I kept some things," she said. "I thought maybe one day you'd be old enough to handle them. I didn't know you'd need them at a funeral." Her fingers trembled when she pointed at the envelope. I could see the way her knuckles had widened from years of hard work, the way she held a cigarette like a lifeline and this little paper like a detonator. "You're sure?" Jason asked, even though his voice was small and his hands were clenched into fists in his pockets. Grandma nodded, and for a moment we all stood there in the dark with the sound of a distant lawnmower and the clink of forks from inside the house. I felt like a man waking up from anesthesia and realizing his bones had been rearranged. I said, "We need everything. Names, notes, dates, everything." Grandma looked at me, narrowed her eyes like she was measuring the weight of my promise, then said, "There's a box in my attic. I kept her things. Be careful with what you find." "The attic," she said, like it was a geography nobody wanted to map until tonight. He told me the whole thing like it was a stitch-by-stitch confession he'd been saving for the right moment, but it came out of Grandma like a tide that had been held back too long. She started at the obvious place. Mom had been brilliant, the kind of kid who read microscopes like friends and lit up at science fairs. She had a full scholarship to a state university for biology, dorm assignment already set, letters from professors waiting. Grandma said she had plans, real ones. The sentence sat heavy between us and the night air. Grandma described how my father, the teacher, worked his way in. Tutoring at first, she said, like it was a neat step in a lesson plan that had gone rotten. He offered extra help after school, sat close at the library table, and always had a book to recommend. He wrote comments on her essays that started formal and then got personal. "Good insight, what a mind," he'd write. Then the italics crept in, notes that read like praise but smelled like ownership. She showed us one page from a dusty notebook. Lines underlined with a name beside them, and the handwriting was mine, familiar and wrong. He told her she wasn't like the other girls, Grandma said, and there was this hollow in her voice that I could feel. He told her she could go far if she followed him. That line made my stomach drop because it showed the shape of the trap. Carve out a girl from her peers, make her feel chosen, then wedge a future inside the space you created. Grandma kept using the word coached like it was sport, and I kept thinking about the way a coach can choose a captain and ruin the rest. 2 weeks before prom, things escalated. Grandma's voice got tight and she looked down at her hands like she was reading something secret written on her skin. She described a night that had the ordinary trappings of a teacher-student rendezvous, extra tutoring, a movie showing, a drive back past the river, and then the calculated part. He did it on purpose, she said plainly. He made sure she couldn't leave. She said he sabotaged any chance of college by engineering a pregnancy. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. I heard the word like a slap. He removed protection, she said, and there was no pity or softening around it, only a cold, direct fact. I kept thinking about all the small things that had been nudged into place: prom corsage, a borrowed dress, pictures staged to look like any happy night. Grandma handed me a faded movie ticket and a tiny corsage pin wrapped in tissue paper, and when I held them, my hands felt like they belonged to someone else. She said Mom was confused at first, then trapped. She had been young and scared and told she had made a choice to stay. She stayed because they told her it was the only way, Grandma said, and I could hear the way history had been pressed into the past like a bruise. Grandma didn't stop with my mother. She told us there were whispers about other girls, 3 or 4, who had disappeared from class lists, moved away, or been quietly switched to other teachers. She named a couple of them out loud, not to point blame, but to mark them as people who'd been unfairly erased. They were the same age, she said. He picked them for the same reasons. She talked about parents who were ashamed or scared, counselors who wrote notes that were never filed, and a principal who liked the school's reputation more than justice. I kept picturing classrooms where a man in authority looked like a hero and a predator at the same time. Jason stood close and listened like he was reading through our past for the first time. He whispered, "Why didn't anyone stop him?" And his voice sounded like it came from far away. Grandma's answer was simple and brutal. People covered for him because he was a respected teacher and people feared scandal. Our town closes ranks, she said. It eats its own shame before it lets anyone else see it. The idea that our mother's life had been bartered for appearances made me want to scream, but the funeral inside kept rolling on like a train over a bridge. Inside, acquaintances were talking about what a devoted teacher he'd been, telling stories about his lesson plans and choir nights as if nothing had been wrong. That cognitive dissonance was like pressure in my skull. Every polite condolence felt like salt thrown into a wound that was already raw. I gripped the porch railing and felt the wood creak under my hands. The physical sound anchored me because everything else felt unreal, like a bad dream that kept replaying itself on loop. Grandma finally reached up and pointed me to her attic. "There are boxes," she said. "Old notes, letters, a diary maybe. I put some things away because I thought I was protecting you." The attic was the kind of place where you put things you no longer want to see but can't throw away. She warned me it won't be easy. Some things will be honest and ugly, and some things will ask questions you don't want to answer. I nodded, the world narrowing down to that attic and whatever paper truth lived inside. We sat for a long time after that, the 3 of us on the porch, and the sounds from the house leaked out, laughter that didn't reach our corner, a glass clink, a voice offering another comforting memory of our father. I kept thinking about plans interrupted, about a scholarship letter folded into a pocket that should have led to a dorm room instead of a marriage certificate. I thought about what we would do next, how we would handle the box, the names, the proof. My hands still smelled faintly of smoke from Grandma's cigarette, and I could feel the weight of things about to be opened. I drove with Jason in silence, the radio off because neither of us wanted noise between us and what we were about to do. Grandma's kitchen smelled like boiled coffee and old paper when she pushed the box across the table like it had been waiting for decades. She didn't say much, just set it down and tapped the lid like a judge passing a verdict. "Be gentle," she said, and her voice sounded like it had been carved out of granite. We took the box back to Jason's apartment and dumped it on his coffee table. Yearbooks fell out first, loose photos and tassels, faces frozen in hairstyles that dated everything. There was a faculty portrait of my father from that era, hair combed and tie-tidy, looking like a man who belonged on a program cover. Next to it, a crinkled class schedule listed English Mr. Harlow, 3rd period. Seeing his name there on paper made it real in a way the funeral hadn't. I felt like my hands were not my own as I flipped through pages. The graded essays were the worst. At first the comments were the kind any teacher writes, "Good thesis, expand idea here." Then the tone slid. One margin read, "You have an old soul, you understand pain more than your peers." Another said, "You see literature on a deeper level than the rest, keep that curiosity." Those notes looked like praise until you read them like a map to manipulation. I traced my thumb over the looping handwriting and felt something in my chest tighten into a knot. Jason's voice was low when he read a line aloud. Look at this, you shouldn't waste your brilliance on city college life. You deserve more than this town can give you. He looked at me like someone who'd seen a missing piece snap into place and wanted to throw the puzzle across the room. We both knew what that sentence was meant to do, lift her up, then handcuff her future to his version of it. The diary was wrapped in tissue and tied with a ribbon that had gone brittle with age. When I opened it, my hands shook. The entries were plain and small, the handwriting steady like someone used to late-night studying. She wrote about after-class meetings that felt like private lessons but left her stomach hollow. She wrote about him touching her shoulder while reading an essay over her desk, how his fingers lingered like a question without an answer. He says I'm special, one entry read. He says I'm different. I don't know what to think. Reading that made my throat close and my eyes hot. There was an entry 2 weeks before prom that made everything collapse inward. It described a tutoring session that turned into a drive, a movie, and a kiss that she didn't understand was part of a plan. He told me I was chosen, she wrote. He said we would have a life together. The words were simple and small like the rest, but the implication was a bomb. She didn't write about protection or consent in those pages. She wrote about confusion and flattery and believing the man who directed her future. Tucked inside tissue was the acceptance letter, the one for biology at the state university. The envelope had a campus logo and a handwritten note on the inside that said, "We look forward to your bright future." The paper felt like a ghost in my hands, proof of a path stolen. I pressed the letter flat against the coffee table and imagined the dorm room that never happened, the microscope she would have loved, the labs she would have crowded into like a place of worship. Jason found a small corsage pin wrapped in a cloth, and I found a crumpled movie ticket dated 2 weeks before prom. Those objects were ordinary and ordinary made decisive, like props in a play where she was the only one not reading from the script. We spread everything out like evidence, and the room filled with the quiet of people who know their lives are changing. We argued quietly about what to do with the box. Jason said we should take it to Warren, the lawyer Grandma trusted. I said we needed more names, statements, anyone who remembered things differently. We both agreed on one thing without saying it: we wouldn't confront Dad alone. The idea of him drunk and defensive and charming still sat between us like a live wire, dangerous to touch without gloves. I called Miranda that night and left a voice message. "We found stuff. Can we talk?" My fingers hovered over the call button, then dropped. I felt like we were walking into a storm, only we now had paper that could direct lightning. We pushed the photos and letters back into the box for the ride to Warren's office, but the pages kept wanting to escape like animals trapped in a cage. As we packed up, Jason said quietly, "She deserved to go to college." I didn't answer right away because the truth was too heavy to let out in one sentence. I thought about our mother at 16, bright and scared and folded into someone else's plan. I thought about all the small things that had been made into chains. We loaded the box into the car and drove off into a night that suddenly felt full of history and consequence. I, man and only man, started digging online the way you do when you need to pull a wound open and see what's underneath. I searched the year, the high school, the graduating class. I scrolled through faded senior portraits and reunion pages until my eyes stung. I messaged anyone who looked like they might have left town right after graduation, anyone whose profile went quiet. My fingers hovered over names more than once, because every message felt like asking a stranger to open a door that had been locked for 30 years. Grandma watched me and said nothing at first, just folded her hands and looked like she was measuring patience against memory. She had already told us she was sure there were other girls, that some had simply erased themselves from the school paper and moved. I believed her, but believing and proving are different things. I sent messages that said plain stuff. "I'm trying to understand what happened in '92. Did you go to Jefferson High? Did you ever have Mr. Harlow as a teacher?" I kept the messages short because I didn't want to push anyone away before they decided to trust me. Then Miranda answered. She didn't use a lot of words at first, cautious, the way someone becomes after carrying a heavy secret for years. When she wrote back, she gave a little of her story and asked to meet in person. I felt my stomach clench because meeting meant turning rumor into testimony. She agreed to meet at a diner 2 towns over, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that never gets cold. I told Jason and he said, "We should go, don't go alone." I promised we'd both be there because the idea of confronting memory alone felt like walking a thin bridge. The diner smelled like grease and lemon cleaner when we sat in the booth and watched Miranda walk in. She looked older, hardened in a way that made my chest ache. I introduced myself in a way that felt stupidly formal. "I'm the son of," and then I stopped because labels don't hold people. I told her plain and simple, "We found some things. We think my father, your old teacher, was involved with some girls." Miranda folded her hands on the table like she was bracing for impact. She told us slowly the things Grandma had hinted at. He paid attention to some of us, she said, and the tremor in her voice said what the words didn't. She told us she had been confused by the attention, flattered at first, then scared. It was like being chosen for a team, she said, but the team was the wrong sport. She named a few girls, pointed to faces in yearbook photos, and told us where some of them had gone. One moved out of state, another transferred schools mid-year, one dropped out entirely. Those empty seats, she explained, had been filled with silence. Miranda described a pattern. After class meetings, she said, trips to the library that lasted too long, he would tell us we were different, that other kids couldn't see what we could. And when a girl got close, she changed, we were praised in private and isolated in public. She talked about how adults stepped around it, how parents were told it was youthful confusion or mutual affection, how the pressure to avoid scandal shut doors that should have swung open. She spoke about fear, fear of not being believed, fear of ruining futures by speaking up, fear that telling would mean reliving. I asked her directly, did he do it to your friends? Her hand trembled on the coffee cup and she nodded. Yes, she said, it happened to more than one of us. Some pregnancies ended quietly, some families packed up and left. She named Lynette, and when she said that name, I felt the room fall away. Miranda's eyes filled and she said, people made choices to protect their daughters in the short term, moving them away, keeping them quiet. That felt like the only option then. We asked her about dates. She gave us timelines and recollections. A teacher who always volunteered for prom chaperone duty, the same man who offered extra tutoring during a season when some girls were suddenly absent. She recalled whispered warnings in hallways, a guidance counselor who wrote notes that were filed away and forgotten. When she spoke of the prom night 2 weeks after the acceptance letters, she said, there was a moment when things shifted for a few of us. It stopped being school and became his plan. I listened and wrote everything down. I felt the weight of each sentence like a stone being added to a pile we'd carry to a lawyer. Miranda agreed to give a written statement later. She said, I don't want to make this about revenge. I want it to be about truth. Her eyes were steady when she said it, like someone who'd finally found a reason to exhume the past. As we left the diner, the sky was the thin gray of late afternoon and my hands felt numb. I thought about the acceptance letter in my hand back home, the scholarship paper folded neat like a life that had been planned and then taken. I thought about the girls who disappeared and the ones who stayed and married the only future offered them. Miranda walked to her car and waved, then drove off, and I realized how many small acts of courage it would take to turn the soft, terrible truth into something that could change things. Back in the car, Jason said, we're not the only ones. I said, no, we're not. And for the first time since the funeral, the search felt like a thing we could do together, not just to punish, but to make sure no one else had to lose their life for someone else's lies. I drove back to the diner 3 days later because one meeting wasn't enough, and because this had stopped being just my grief and started being something that needed answers. I, man and only man, sat across from Miranda in a booth that smelled like burnt coffee and old grease, and she hunched over a paper cup of tea like it was the only thing keeping her steady. She didn't look at me at first. She unfolded her hands and said, he picked the ones who needed him most. The sentence landed plain and hard. Miranda told me how my father had moved from tutoring to a pattern of hunting for vulnerability. Scholarship kids, she said, girls who wanted out of town, girls hungry for praise. She named names carefully like someone setting down fragile dishes. One of them was Lynette Green, whom she called a smart girl who vanished from the senior roster mid-year. Her parents moved her, Miranda said. They got her out after they started seeing him pay too much attention. Hearing Lynette's name made my stomach do something cold and loud, because I'd been trying to stitch those empty seats into a timeline and now a face fit the place. Miranda explained the way adults reacted then, how people explained things away. They told us it was mutual, she said, or that we were just naive. She shrugged and added, some parents were told to be quiet, others were told moving was easier than fighting. The way she said it made me think of how often people choose comfort over truth and how convenient silence can protect the powerful. I asked, were you all too young to understand it? Her answer was immediate and soft. We were kids. We thought attention was the same as care. We didn't know grooming till later. I left the diner with a list of names and a quiet sense of how wide the thing might be. Miranda agreed to give a written account later and asked for time, for the chance to prepare her words. I promised her we'd be careful and that we weren't looking for revenge, just truth. Then I called Mrs. Perkins, the retired guidance counselor, because Miranda had mentioned parents talking to someone and Mrs. Perkins' name had come up in the rumor thread more than once. I felt like we were following a map made of half-remembered footsteps, and Mrs. Perkins was a person who might know where the paths crossed. Mrs. Perkins invited Jason and me to her small apartment, which smelled like old books and lemon cleaner. She was shorter in person than I expected, hair set tight and eyes sharp like she still remembered filing things neatly. She sat with her hands folded and said, "I kept a folder. It made me sleepless sometimes." Then she went to a closet and pulled out a manila file that looked like it had been compressed flat under years of other papers. The label read simply, "Harlow Complaints, 1993. She spread the papers on her kitchen table and started pointing out entries. Some were notes she'd made after meetings with parents, lines like, "Mr. Harlow meeting, parent concerned about time spent after class, suggests transfer." Other pieces were copies of phone logs showing calls from worried mothers and a note, "Principal advised caution, reputation at stake." There were handwritten lines from other teachers and a dated memo that said, "Observe interactions, do not escalate publicly." Mrs. Perkins' voice was flat when she read them aloud, like she was reciting weather patterns from a storm long past. "There were patterns," she said. "Not one complaint, a series, girls moved away. One note says pregnancy suspected and then the paper trail ends because the parent left town." She tapped a stack of papers and added, "I saved everything I could. Some of it I filed here, some I tucked away, and some I feared would get lost if I handed it up the chain." Her hands trembled when she said that, and I realized how much courage it must have taken to keep the scraps of truth in a shoebox instead of letting them be swallowed. I asked her why nothing had been done then, and she sighed. "People protected the school and the man," she said. "Principals feared lawsuits, pastors feared scandal, parents feared the damage to their daughters' futures, so most things were steered toward moving a girl, not toward confronting the man." That sentence explained too much. It explained the empty chairs in yearbooks, the sudden transfers, the hushed decisions to leave town. It explained how my mother's scholarship could be quietly rendered useless by a pregnancy no one fought for. She handed us copies of a few notes and the names she remembered, some parents with numbers she still kept. "If you want to pursue this," she said, "start by gathering statements and dates, put them in order, then find a lawyer who doesn't flinch." Her tone was practical, not sentimental. She slid a small envelope across the table with a torn note inside. "Lynette Green transferred to St. Mary S. August 92. That paper felt like a line on a map pointing to a place we had to visit. Walking back to the car with Jason, papers in my hand, I felt the distance between what we had been told about our father and what the pile of notes showed stretch into a canyon. We had names now, dates, and a retired counselor willing to swear to the file she kept. The next step was gathering people willing to tell their stories, and the plans in my head started to stack themselves into a shape with edges sharp enough to cut. I, man and only man, sat across from Mrs. Perkins' guidance counselor with a stack of notes that felt like a map to something ugly, and she slid more papers toward me like a dealer passing over the next hand. Her voice was low and steady as she spoke, and every name she gave landed like a weight on the table. "There were complaints," she said, and then she started listing dates, phone calls, parents who'd come in worried. She handed us copies of messages where mothers wrote about their daughters being kept after class, or staying at school with him longer than was normal for tutoring. I held the pages and felt my hands go cold because the handwriting, the dates, and the small details fit into the pattern we were already starting to see. Mrs. Perkins pushed one small card across to me and said, "This is Lynette Green, be careful, she might not want to talk about it." Her tone was warning and gentle at the same time, like someone asking you to handle a raw thing with gloves on. The card had a phone number on it and a note in her handwriting, "Moved away 92. She told us about a student who'd collapsed in class after a chaperone trip, about grades that slid like a cliff, and about parents who came to her office one by one, worried and unsure. The file smelled faintly of old paper and lemon cleaner, and I kept thinking how many small moments of fear had been collected there like pebbles. A few days later, Jason and I met Lynette victim at a park because Mrs. Perkins had said she preferred open air and small talk before anything heavy. Lynette brought her husband for support, and he stayed a step behind her the whole time, hands folded like a shield. I remember the way Lynette looked at us, like she was measuring whether we were safe to hand a part of her life over to. She was different than the photo in the yearbook. Time had tightened her face, but there was a fierce thing in her eyes that said she had survived something that could have broken her. We sat on a bench and she started slowly, like remembering had a cost. "We were poor," she said plainly, and the word made everything line up like a sentence completing itself. "Money was thin and college felt like a lifeline." She told us how my father had offered extra tutoring at first, how he picked the ones who were trying to climb out. "He made you feel like you were smart enough, like you could go away," she said. Her voice had a memory in it that got quieter when she talked about what happened next. "Then he made his attention worth something, you felt like you owed him." Lynette described being drawn in by attention and promises, and then what came after, intimacy that was framed as care and then turned into control. I got pregnant, she said, and the word landed between us with no flourish. She told us she later miscarried and that her parents wanted to take it to the police, but they were advised against it. Our pastor said a scandal would destroy her, she said, and she spat the last words like they were poison. Her husband put his hand on her knee and squeezed, and I watched the way grief softened under a steady touch. The story she told was ordinary and terrible. A family with little power told to protect the daughter's future by leaving the town that had hurt her. When she said the pastor convinced them to move, I felt a bitter heat in my chest because that line explained so much of the covering up we'd been tracing. They packed us up at dawn, she said, like we were running from a storm that never came. Lynette explained how being uprooted felt like punishment for being harmed, how moving kept a name clean while taking a girl's chance away. It was better than staying, she admitted, voice breaking. At least out there I could bury what happened. Her honesty cut through any notion that people had acted out of goodness. It was fear that drove decisions, and fear was stronger than truth in that moment. She listened when I told her about the acceptance letter we found and how the prom photos made me feel like someone had stolen a future. That could have been me, she said quietly, and then she looked at Jason. That could have been anyone. Her words stayed with me like a vow. Before we left, she agreed to give a written statement, but she warned us she'd need time and that revisiting it would reopen things that had scarred her. I don't do this for revenge, she said. I do it so kids now don't have to be traded for a reputation. Walking away from the park, papers and names in my head, I felt a new kind of responsibility settle in. We had stories now, Lynette S. among them, and a trail that led back through priestly advice, school silence, and quiet exiles. The list of people who'd been hurt felt heavier every time we added a name, but the small courage of a woman speaking in a park gave me something we hadn't had before, a path to move forward, and a reason to keep pushing until the paper trail had nowhere left to hide. I, man and only man, sat in my car with the folder on my lap and felt my hands tremble because this was no longer a private grief. It was a stack of cause and effect that could change lives. Grandma had already called Warren Hale lawyer for me. She said he knew how to turn old wounds into something a town couldn't ignore. Warren met with Jason and me first in his cramped office, and he laid everything out without drama. Criminal charges are a long shot, he said, flat and honest, but civil suits, public statements, and protective measures are all on the table. Hearing that made my throat work like I was swallowing a decision. Warren explained the mechanics in simple terms that made sense to two men who'd never dealt with courtrooms. He said, "We gather everything, dates, names, statements. We create a narrative you can prove. Then we offer your father choices, public acknowledgement, restitution, or we go public with the evidence and file suits." He didn't promise revenge. He promised structure and consequences. I remember Jason leaning forward in the chair, eyes fixed like he was measuring the distance between words and action. Warren's hands moved over our stack of papers like a reader testing a book's spine. Over the next week, we turned the apartment into a war room. We cataloged diary entries, typed transcripts of Miranda's and Lynette's accounts, copied Mrs. Perkins' notes, photographed yearbook pages, and kept my mother's acceptance letter in the center like the heart of it all. Every item we touched felt heavier. Dad's voicemail messages shifted while we worked. First, there were confused, half-drunk messages asking if I'd inherited anything important. Then later, there were pleading ones where his voice cracked. "I didn't mean," he slurred in one message, and another said, "If I hurt anyone, I'm sorry." Hearing him fumble with the words in recordings made me feel both angry and sick. Warren warned us not to confront Dad without a plan. "You cannot let him manipulate the moment," he told us. "He's had practice with charm. This needs to be a legal meeting, not a family crisis." That advice sat like armor. We packed the folder with copies and labeled documents, notes on witnesses, and a cover letter that laid out the accusations as calmly as a ledger. Jason and I practiced what we would say, then threw the practice away because nothing rehearsed could match Dad's real face. When Warren said we were ready, we picked a neutral place to meet. A downtown coffee shop with a table by the window where people watched life go by without asking questions. We told Dad we needed to talk about the estate and asked him to come at 2. He arrived looking thinner than I'd seen, shirt stained at the collar like the last of his dignity stuck there. He sat down, and for a second he looked like the man in the faculty photo, the one who'd managed a reputation so carefully. The folder slid between us like an accusation with a spine. I watched as he flipped through the first pages, diary excerpts, acceptance letters, yearbook photos, and his face fell in stages like someone watching a house burn in slow motion. He tried to talk his way out at first. "It was consensual," he said, using the word like armor. "They were adults in spirit." Warren cut him off quietly with a look and said, "The law in the last 30 years don't see it that way." Dad's voice narrowed. "You're ruining me," he told us, then tried a different route. "I loved your mother, I loved her, you can't." His words broke and the charm slewed off like old paint. Warren laid out the options like a balanced scale. Option 1, he said, public acknowledgement, an apology signed and distributed, financial restitution put into a trust for educational scholarships in your mother's name, offer counseling and funding for survivor services. He read it slowly while Dad's hands shook on the table. Option 2, Warren continued, we go public with these records, invite media and prepare civil suits that will ensure community reckoning. Jason's jaw tightened. I could feel the air compress around us, like someone had tightened the lid on a pot that wanted to scream. Dad tried to bargain. Please, he said, I'll write the letters, I'll do the donations, keep it quiet. His voice sounded small under the weight of the folder. Warren asked for immediate commitment in writing and a signed agreement outlining the restitution and public acknowledgement. Dad hesitated, then his eyes slid to mine, and I saw not an apology so much as calculation. I thought about the nights he'd lied like second nature and felt the old rage. Still, Warren insisted we offer a choice because it would make the truth official no matter what Dad chose. In the end, Dad put his name to it. He signed an initial agreement to the apology letters and the financial settlement Warren had outlined. It wasn't forgiveness, no step toward forgiveness happened, but it was accountability in a paper form that could be shown in court and in headlines. As he signed, his hand trembled and his voice was low. I don't remember everything, he said, and the admission landed like a cold stone. When we walked out of the coffee shop, the sky had that late light that makes everything look honest. The folder felt lighter because it was no longer just a sealed thing in our hands, it was a lever. We had chosen a path to force the town to look. I felt exhausted and oddly relieved. We weren't finished, there were statements to file, people to protect, and a town to push, but we had taken the step that made secrets harder to hide. Dad's pleadings had met paper, and the paper was now louder than his voice. He flipped through the pages and the color left his face like someone had shut off the lights. I sat there watching the paper do what my voice could not, show in black and white every promise my father had broken. The acceptance letter, crisp and hopeful, sat beside diary entries that read like a confession of confusion. Miranda's statement was calm and steady. Lynette's voice trembled on the page the way it had in the park. Mrs. Perkins' notes were clinical and relentless, dates, calls, a pattern of behavior no one had wanted to see. At first he tried to talk. They were adults in spirit, he mumbled like a prayer. I loved her. The words came out soft, then sharper as though he was trying to carve them into something that felt true. Warren didn't flinch. He set the folder down and laid out the choices with the same clarity he'd shown in his office. Public acknowledgement, apology letters to each identified victim, and a donation of your late wife's life insurance to survivor services, or we release the records to the press and pursue civil suits. Warren's voice was steady and final. It felt like an exam with only two answers. I watched Dad's hands shake as he signed the binder of documents. There was no dramatic confession, no sobbing redemption. He put his name on paper like someone keeping the last scrap of dignity, but also like someone realizing that paper could be a cage. The papers we slid across the table were binding, apology language, restitution terms, a pledge to fund counseling, and the scholarship we wanted to start in Mom's name for girls studying biology. He signed, and the signatures felt like a first rung on a ladder of accountability. It wasn't enough to erase what he'd done, but it made hiding harder. The fallout began quickly. The church split in ways the town still talks about, pews that once sat shoulder to shoulder emptied or filled with people who couldn't reconcile comfort with truth. Pastor Michael, who had advised families to avoid scandal, found himself defending choices he'd made decades earlier. Some people doubled down, calling my father a devoted teacher who'd been misunderstood. Others looked at him with a face I'd never seen until that day, cold and betrayed. It was ugly and public in a way our family had never expected, and it hurt to watch neighbors choose sides like they were setting up fences. The school district launched reviews and searches into buried complaints and old personnel files. Mrs. Perkins' folder became a focus, not an embarrassment. Her notes, once shoved into a closet, were now subpoenas and evidence. The district's search found other troubling patterns, teachers with suspicious records, complaints that were minimized, and policies that prioritized reputation over safety. Lawsuits were filed. Some families settled. The school eventually changed policies, installed mandatory training, and created reporting systems no one could easily drown in paperwork again. Miranda did something I didn't expect. She went back to school to study how to help people like us. She trained as a trauma counselor and opened a practice focused on survivors of authority-based abuse. She told me she wanted to give other people a safe place she never had. Seeing her work with clients months later, hearing her calm voice help someone name what happened, that felt like a small miracle. Lynette, who had been pulled from town at the worst time, began volunteering with a local support group when she felt ready. Her husband held her steady. and she started telling her story not as a wound but as a warning. Mrs. Perkins led staff trainings on grooming recognition. She stood in school auditoriums and read from her old notes, not to shame people but to make sure no one could say later they hadn't known. She pushed for mandatory reporting and for the district to fund independent reviews when complaints arose. Her voice, which once trembled in a small apartment, grew firm in public meetings. People listened because the paper trail she'd kept could not be dismissed. Warren helped set up the scholarship in Mom's name. We called it the Harlow Memorial Scholarship for Women in Biology, and the first recipient was a girl with the same hunger for microscopes and field research that our mother had. At the awards ceremony, Miranda sat in the front row and wiped her eyes, and Lynette sent a photo of her daughter studying at a lab bench. It didn't bring my mother's future back, and the ache of that stayed with us, but the scholarship felt like a small correction, money and opportunity where manipulation had tried to place a stop sign. The town changed, slowly and with resistance. Some people never forgave us for speaking up, others quietly thanked us for making it safer for their kids. The pastor resigned. The school restructured oversight. The survivors found each other and the language to name what had happened to them. I learned that truth can be messy and unfair, but it is also a kind of medicine. None of this returned the life taken from my mother. What it did was make sure the story didn't get buried under polite condolences and hymn book reverence. It gave her a legacy, her name attached to a scholarship, her memory carried by women shepherding futures she never had. And maybe most important, it pulled the cover off the places predators hide, forcing a town to choose whether it valued appearances over safety. We made that choice public, and the paper we put down on that coffee shop table became louder than any apology my father had muttered. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below, I'd love to hear your thoughts.